There's no. All right, I think we're good to go with all that. Before we get started tonight, I just wanted to let everybody know a few things. I don't know if you got to be able to see the devotional yet. One is for our elders and deacons and preacher and all those. Remember this Sunday morning at 8:30, we have a leaders meeting. So anybody who can to be there for that, that's in that group, remember that'll be this Sunday morning at 8:30. The other announcement, or other thing I was going to mention to you, is this Sunday. We may or may not be here. I don't know how many of you know, but Paula's daddy's not doing very well at all. They've just given him a few days at most to live. So depending on when he passes and the funeral and all that. So just a heads up, on Sunday, we may not be here, me and Paul and the family. If I'm not here, Brother Joe's going to be ready to speak for us. But like I said, depends on when he passes, and from there, when the funeral is whether or not we'll be here. So I just want to give y'all a heads up. So if y'all come in Sunday and we're not there, that's where we are. We'll keep everybody up to date and tell you anything that happens to know about what's any arrangements, let you know when we're leaving. There are other things, but if you missed that and we're not here Sunday, that's why we're not here. I believe that's all that I got for that. So we'll get right into our class tonight, maybe. Let's see. All right, let's try this again. All right, here we go. We are in Genesis 50. We are talking about the end of the book of Genesis. We're speaking about Jacob's death. We're going to finish talking about Jacob's death and his burial. And then we're going to look with the final dealings of Joseph. We're going to look at the final two things he does. The two things that are recorded about him in this great book, the beginnings. And so you remember last week we got to about verse 9 of chapter 50. As we got to verse 9, we were looking at the idea of Joseph and his family and the caravan that was going with them. That as they went to Canaan to bury Jacob in his family tomb, that he was, his body at least, was attended with the royals of Egypt. Pharaoh's servants, a lot of the higher up officials went with them. As we said last week, that what we read about here in the book of Genesis and how it describes here, this was a royal funeral. As we know, we sometimes talk about some funerals are packed with people and the stars come out and the big names come out. That's really what happens with Jacob. Some Bible commentators have said that the description of Jacob's funeral here is a very similar picture to what a lot of the pyramids in Egypt, the Pharaoh's tombs, and the royalty tombs that are found in Egypt, the hieroglyphics and the pictures of their funeral procession would have echoed very similar to what Jacob had here. And Jacob had these people who traveled with him. I believe it's about a 130-mile trio from Goshen or so into Shechem and into the place where he's going to be buried. And so he's coming, they're coming along, and not only to have the royal officials, that was what we got to last week in verse 9. It says there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. So what happens is they have this huge crowd. And not only have this huge crowd, but Pharaoh not only sends the crowd and the people with him, he also sends warriors. He sends chariots and horsemen. He sends army officials that are going to march with Joseph and march with his father, with his family. And again, that last verse, it was a great last phrase. It was a very great company. The idea here was this was extravagant. This was huge. And when they come in, they're traveling and they get to this place of a threshing floor. Exactly where this is, the threshing floor of Atad, we don't know, or Atad. That word Atad basically means the bramble bush, I believe it is, or thorn bush. We really have no clue where this was, but it's a threshing floor, a big flat surface where they would have been probably on top of a hill. We would assume this would be at an oasis where they would have shade and water and refreshment, something to refresh by. And they come to this threshing floor, and there they lamented. Now, this is a very interesting phrase that they did this because you remember they've already lamented 7 days. They've had 70 days of mourning for Jacob. Now they're traveling on this funeral procession, and they get to this threshing floor, and here they lamented again, and they stopped and they lament for 7 more days. They lament for another week, and some have wondered why they did this. We really don't know. I mean, we have no explanation of why they stopped here again to have this 7 days of lamenting. All we can say is that they did. Some have suggested maybe this was to stop and restock their supplies while they lamented. Some have thought this may be the time to stop and rest from traveling in the hot sun. We really don't know. Now, we're going to talk about this next point, or part of a phrase in that verse, and the next verse as well, verse 11. It says, when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore, the place was called Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. So you notice that they come here into this land, and they begin to come to this threshing floor, this huge company, and begin to mourn. And it's such a great mourning that the inhabitants of the land realize this and point to it as being a place of mourning. As a matter of fact, that word Abel Mizraim is the Abel is another, there is a play on the word Ebel that is mourning. And this place is called the mourning, Abel is, I believe, the valley or the plain or something of that nature. And they basically called this the place of the the place of the Egyptians mourning. That Mizraim is Israel, is the Hebrew word for Egyptian, And so they come to this place. Now, the question that comes up with this verse is the end of that, and end of verse 11 and end of verse 10 is the phrase, it is beyond the Jordan. What does that necessarily mean? Some have said this phrase is always a reference to the west side of the Jordan, meaning that Canaan's on the east and the Moab in that area is on the west, and therefore that this is a description of that far side of the Jordan. However, that's not necessarily the case. And that would not seem to be the case here. Some people think that this was the case here. What they would basically say is that Joseph and his group, instead of traveling the 130-mile straight path, that they had to take a 300-mile trip to go in a circle, to go around the Dead Sea and up that side, just like the Israelites would later do in the wanderings, cross the Jordan, and then go down to where the field is to bury Jacob, and then go home from there. What's typically thought of this beyond the Jordan is that it is a description of where it is based on the person who's writing it, based on where they're at. And so this beyond the Jordan in Joshua is speaking about the Israelites taking the land of Canaan. He'll describe both the eastern side and the western side as being beyond the Jordan. And so that is a phrase that is very fluid. Now, there are some who say that because they think that has to describe that one side of the river. However, the problem with that is the first part of verse 11, in that the inhabitants of the land are said to be Canaanites. And we know the Canaanites stayed on that east side of the river. We know they stayed at the one side. They stayed on the side we're used to, with Jerusalem in that area. And so it says here, the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites saw them. So I think this, although some people may try to say this, they took this long journey, I think that indication to me says that they took this short journey. This beyond the Jordan is not meaning the other side of the Jordan from the Canaan land, but it's just a reference to where Moses was when he wrote this. And so he speaks of this place. They stopped there. And they stopped here for a week. And again, no matter where this place is, we know they stopped here for a week, and then they began their journey again. Because see again in verse 12, that thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. And then you notice verse 13, pick it back up there. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in a cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So here we see again Joseph and his brothers fulfilling Jacob's command in that he be buried in this family tomb, buried in the family cave. And again, this cave would have had shelves dug out in, hewn out in it that you would place the body upon. And so here we have Jacob finally coming to his final resting place beside his wife Leah, with his father Isaac and Rebekah, and also in the same tomb where Abraham and Sarah were buried. And so he does this, and then we notice the last part of this is that after all this is over, Joseph he keeps his word to Pharaoh. We talked about that may have been part of Pharaoh's talk or worry, is wondering if Joseph would come back. So here we see that after he buries his father, Joseph comes back to Egypt. Not only does Joseph come back, his brothers come back, and all those who go with him. So Joseph brings all the people back, just as they promised Pharaoh they would do. And so Pharaoh and the Egyptians see that Joseph is true and keeping up and keeping his word with them. So after this, we get into the next part, and for next part, we're going to see two little interactions with Joseph. We're going to see two things that happen to Joseph as he goes when he returns home. Verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the Lord, of the God of your father." Joseph wept, and when they spoke, Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." Now, notice what happens here, and we'll see the rest of this in just a minute. Joseph's brothers are now seeing that Jacob has died and Jacob is gone, and they begin to talk among themselves and question about what is Joseph going to do. Now, again, the idea here is that this happens sometime after Jacob's death. We don't know how soon or how quickly after his death this happens, but the brothers begin to look around and say, okay, maybe Joseph was just being nice to us because daddy was still alive, is what we say in common English. Maybe Joseph is sparing us because he doesn't want to cause us harm while daddy's alive. And now that daddy's gone, daddy's not going to keep Joseph wrangled in. And so Joseph has the ability, if he wants to again, strike them dead on the spot. He has all that authority that he can do as he pleases to them. And so the brothers are very nervous about this. You know, verse 16, they sent a message to Joseph. Now, this is an interesting thing for a couple of reasons. Number one, they send a message. They don't come to Joseph and say, "Here, this is what's bothering us, and this is what your father said." Instead, they send a third party. They send someone else into Joseph and say, "Your father gave a command before he died. And that command," he says, "is for Joseph to please forgive the transgression of your brothers and forgive their sin because they did you evil." Now, what's interesting about this is that a lot of Bible scholars, and even we can look at it as we read and study the Bible and ask the question of, was this truly a command of Joseph or Jacob? We can ask this because we can say, okay, if Jacob really wanted Joseph to do this, why didn't Jacob give this command to Joseph himself? We just saw the last 3 chapters. Jacob had Joseph to himself for part of that when he called Joseph and his 2 sons in. he very well, if this would have been his command, why didn't he give this to them? A second thing about this is it's not recorded in the book of Genesis of Jacob ever giving this kind of command at all to his sons, and less to his sons to tell Jacob. And so a lot of people will look at this and say, well, we've already seen Joseph's brothers be pretty deceptive and pretty tricky themselves. So there's a thought that maybe they come up with this themselves. And again, we're not sure where they come up with this command, if it was from Jacob or not. It doesn't really matter about what Joseph's going to do to it. But they come to Joseph and they basically beg his forgiveness. They finally beg Joseph to forgive them for what they've done. Forgive them for their selling him into slavery all those years ago. And then here again, we see the tender heart of Joseph at the end of verse 17, where Joseph weeps. Joseph cries in the midst of this time with his brothers. And some have said that whenever we see Joseph and him weeping in the book of Genesis, Joseph is not a quiet mourner. He's not a quiet crier. You remember when his brothers, when he reveals himself to his brothers, the servants and people around, and even the house of Pharaoh eventually hears about his crying, his weeping, because it's so loud, and he has to excuse himself a time or two to cry as well. So some people think, or what most people think, is that his brothers were either outside his home or waiting in a hallway nearby when Joseph was giving this message. And when they hear Joseph's reaction, when they hear Joseph crying, they come in and they realize that he probably wasn't going to do what they just accused him of doing. I think Joseph realized that they're afraid for their life, and he's upset about this. And they don't realize, one of the things I read today getting ready for this, I thought was interesting, said that the brothers don't realize just how much Joseph cared for them, that they thought that Joseph only brought them to Egypt and did all these great things for their father. But we see that Joseph doesn't just do it for their father, he does it for the entire family. And now when they again break his heart because they don't think he's forgiven them, they come before him, and again they say, behold, we are your servants, we're your slaves. They realize just how bad this is. And here again, you have this incident that happened 30 years prior that these brothers are still holding on to, at least 30 years. Because again, Joseph was about 10, 12 years in Canaan by himself, or Egypt by himself. And then Jacob lived in Canaan 17, or Egypt 17 years when he died. So that's where I get the 34, if you're just wondering. But they're holding on this grudge from 30 years prior. And Joseph here sort of tells them, and he's going to say the next verse, that Joseph is going to tell them, I've forgiven you. I went past it. Matter of fact, you notice they say, please forgive the brothers. Joseph never here says that he forgives them. He never mentions that. And I think that's because Joseph in the story has already forgiven them earlier. And Joseph is basically going to say, I don't need to forgive you again. But he's going to say that what happened for a reason. This is a very interesting thing that happens, because we pick back up in verse 19. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant the evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So here you have Joseph comes in. It's very interesting, this first phrase. Joseph says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Well, technically, in human standards, in the land of Egypt, he was in the place of God and brought under the place of God. Pharaoh would have been viewed as God. But Joseph says that I'm not God. I'm not the judge. I'm not the jury and the executioner. This phrase, am I in the place of God, is sort of ironic, because this is a very phrase that Jacob, his father, will say to Rachel, Joseph's mother, just a few chapters earlier, when Rachel gets upset at Joseph or Jacob because Jacob's not giving her any children. And when she tells him to give me children, he says, am I in the place of God? Am I God? That I can choose this? And there the answer was no. And here again, the answer is no. But verse 20, very interesting to Joseph, from Joseph's point of view, is Joseph says that you did this against me. You did evil. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And this is, again, that beautiful ideal we see in the Bible. And we can see in our lives that some things that look evil, look bad, look terrible at the time have actually served a purpose to bring about good. to bring about something positive from it. Because you notice he says that God meant it for good to bring about that many people should be kept alive. That many people should be kept alive as they are today. And again, this is a part of that promise to Abraham. Remember that Abraham was given that promise by God, that seed promise, that he would bless all the nations, that they'd be blessed through him. That is that ultimate point to Christ. But Joseph fulfilled that as well. Joseph was that blessing to all the people, in that all the people would have ceased to exist. The nation of Egypt would have been devastated. The land of Canaan would have been devastated. Jacob's family would have been wiped out. Had it not been for Joseph being in this place, that everything worked out in his favor. And again, the idea that worked out is because God was there. And so Joseph is basically saying here that do not worry, don't be afraid. He says, because God has put me here. God has worked this to the best, as Paul will say in Romans 8, that God worked this out to the best. And then he says, verse 21, do not fear. Don't be afraid of me. And he says, I will provide for you and your little ones. He said, I'll provide for you. I will keep you and I will feed you. I will make sure that you and your family are taken care of. And then you notice it, thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Here again, the brothers come to him. They're upset. They're afraid of what Joseph's going to do, how Joseph's going to react. And they're afraid of Joseph. And Joseph begins to weep and is upset about how they do this. And one other thing real quick, you'll notice back in verse 18, the brothers come in and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. Here again is another fulfillment of that dream of Jacob, or a dream of Joseph, where his brothers would bow down before him. And here they bowed down, and Joseph again tells them, don't worry, don't be afraid. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide for you. He leaves all those fears. He says, I'm not just doing this because of daddy. Now daddy's gone, I'm going to pay you back, but I'm going to take care of you. One other thing about this that we need to probably mention is that in this interaction, Benjamin was probably not involved as well. Was probably not involved here, because remember, Benjamin wasn't old enough to be a part of this. And there's a good indication that Benjamin may not have had to include what happened to Joseph, because Benjamin was so young and he was Joseph's brother, and he was Jacob's favorite. So this is probably the 10 of the 11 sons that did this to Joseph, that came to him. Not necessarily Benjamin was with him. The last one here, the last few verses are talking about Joseph and the end of his life. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. So Joseph stays in Egypt the rest of his life. And he stays there in all of his father's house. None of the Israelites go back to Canaan. And we sort of know that, but the author here, Moses, wants us to know that they stayed. And then we see that Joseph lives to 110 years. What's interesting about 110 years is in Egyptian history and Egyptian historical records, 110 years is the ideal age of an Egyptian. For an Egyptian to live to be 110 was viewed to be their ideal age. And here Joseph lives to be that age, and he dies. And that's what we talked about, I think, in our devotional, is when you look at Joseph's life, Joseph lived 110 years. He lived 17 years, we assume, in Canaan. That's about the time we put him to be sold as a slave. That puts him at being in Egypt for 93 years. In 93 years, he lived in Egypt. He walked like the Egyptians. He talked like them. He dressed like them. He behaved like them for the majority of that time. But yet in all that, he was still true to God. In all that time, he still clinged to his history of being an Israelite, a history of his father and what God had done for them and the promises they made. And so here Joseph lives to be this ripe old age. And then he knows verse 23, some more history about Joseph. Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, and the children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. So basically what this says here is that Ephraim's children, he saw to the third generation. He was the great grandfather. He saw his great grandchildren. And again, in Egyptian culture, and even in the ancient world, to see your grandchildren was a great blessing, but to see great grandchildren was an even greater blessing. And so this is where Joseph is in this rank. And then you notice the children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh. Manasseh was the oldest one. He wasn't the one Jacob blessed as with a greater blessing. But Joseph basically does what his father does. Remember that Jacob takes Ephraim and Manasseh and makes them his own children, sort of adopts them at the end of his life to be equal with Joseph's brothers. Here, Joseph, sometime in his life, probably not the end, but sometime in his life, he takes Manasseh's son Machir and basically adopts him and his family. He claims them to be his son. So since he lost Manasseh and Ephraim, he claimed Machir to be his, and this probably would have happened probably early on. So he would have been able to have this counted toward his family. But after this, we see the last 3 verses of this chapter, verse 24 through verse 26. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So here you see Joseph calls his brothers. Now, there's a little bit of question here, and I don't know exactly what we don't know what brothers this was, if there's any of his brothers alive. Again, Joseph is one of the youngest brothers. He's next to youngest brother besides Benjamin, who's a few years younger than him. Joseph's 110. We'd assume that some of his brothers have probably died, and some think that his brothers here may not literally be his other 11 brothers, but may have been their families. But he says, very similar to Jacob, "I'm about to die." And then he reminds them of God's promise. And this is sort of where Joseph fits, because Joseph has become this leader in Egypt. He has become the leader and the one who is keeping Israel faithful. And you notice he says, "God will visit you and bring you up out of this land." And he's telling them, God will take you to the land of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, take them to Canaan, take them to the promised land. And here Joseph is, although he lived 110 years, he knew this promise. In his life, he didn't see God come back in those 50 years and bring the Israelites back out. The 50 years or so, we assume he was in Egypt, or the Jacob and the Israelites were in Egypt. But he has his faith in God. And where God, in verse 25, where he makes them makes them an oath. They have to swear that they will take him up. That when God comes back, when God comes and delivers Israelites from Egypt, they will take Joseph and they will bury him in Canaan. Now, again, notice he doesn't make the demand to be buried in the cave of his father. He just says, "Take me back to my land." And what's interesting about this is we see later on in the story of what we're going to see next story we go to, next book we go to, the book of Exodus, Moses and the Israelites, when they finally are able to get free, when God does all he does and they get out of the land of Egypt, one of the things we're specifically told that Moses takes is the coffin of Joseph. And we see that coffin being taken back into Canaan. And then in Joshua, we see Joshua going to Shechem, the place where Jacob had land. And there it tells us that he buries Joseph. And so it's very interesting that Joseph had this faith in God. And the other interesting about this is in Hebrews 11, the one thing the Hebrew writer mentions about Joseph in that hall of faith is that Joseph made them promise to take his bones to Canaan. Of all the great things Joseph did, of all the encounters we've read, of all those amazing things that God did through him that the writer could have recorded, he didn't record any of that. He just simply told us that they are, in talking about Joseph's faithfulness, was that promise that he was waiting for that place, that he was waiting for God's deliverance. He is waiting for God to bring the Israelites out. And that's what we're going to see as we continue through our Old Testament. We're going to go into the book of Exodus, and we're going to pick this story up in 400 years, and we're going to see the exit. That's the word Exodus, means exit. We're going to see the exit from Egypt, and we're going to see what God does. But here we have the story of Genesis coming to a close about God and this chosen family of which he would bless the world. And this last recorded son that dies, this last recorded one, not the last one, but the last recorded one that dies is looking to the future. He's looking to God's return and God bringing Israel back and putting them into Canaan. Now, one other interesting little thing about this, the last verse of Genesis, and then we'll be done for tonight, is that when Joseph dies, again, he dies at the age of 110. Again, they embalm him just like they did Jacob. That's been a 40-day process. But here's the interesting thing about this. He was put in a coffin. You want to know some trivia? This is the only place in the Old Testament that you have a reference to a coffin. Is the only account of we have that this of any Israelite put in a coffin. And here's another one. The only two Israelites we have recorded that were embalmed are Jacob and Joseph. And again, that tells us how important, how key, how valuable they were in Egypt. But this ends the story of Genesis. This ends the story of the beginning. This ends the story of Israel and what God is preparing for them and what is lying ahead. And that's sort of where we're going to end tonight as we get through this great book. And as we finish this story of Abraham and his family, and as we wrap up that story, as we begin to go into the next one, as we know, next time we're going to get into the story of Moses. We're going to see about Moses and what he does and that interaction with Moses. And so that is our plan for Wednesday night, is to continue on after this week. We finish Genesis. Next week, we're going to go into Exodus. And so if you want to get ahead next week, we'll look at Exodus chapter 1. Exodus 1 is where we'll begin. We'll begin with the introduction to Exodus, talking about who wrote it and when, and all that good stuff. And then we'll get into that, talking about that book. But for tonight, we're going to stop right there. We're a couple minutes earlier than usual, but that's going to be okay. We got this book finished, so we're doing good there. I'm going to give just a second. If anybody on Zoom has a question or comment about what we talked about, you're free to say that. If not, we're fixing to cut off our live stream, and then we'll be done for the evening. Again, don't forget, for our elders and deacons and leaders and preacher and all that, Sunday morning at 8:30, we have a meeting in the fellowship room. So if you're able to be here for that, we'll have that meeting and make plans to be there. Otherwise, encourage everyone to be back with us Sunday morning. We'll be back at 10 o'clock with our worship, or we'll be here live on YouTube and Facebook. I appreciate everyone's time. And like I say, that's all we have. So we're going to end our stream. We hope that you're all having a good week, and we hope to see you all Sunday or see you